There are places where time doesn't run, it walks barefoot across dry earth. Where each sunrise brings the weight of promises made and the whisper of dreams that never came true. In the heart of the arid lands of West Texas, where the horizon disappears between dust and sky, stands a house. It's not large, not luxurious, but every one of its stones was placed by hands that trembled with hope. Every timber beam was cut thinking of the future. Every wall was raised believing that love would be enough to keep it standing. This is the story of Richard and Helen, two souls who built more than a shelter against the relentless sun. They built a home where life should flourish like the few wildflowers that grow in the desert. But fate, that old acquaintance of farmers, has its own roads. And sometimes those roads don't lead where the heart would wish. Today I invite you to walk with me through this land that guards secrets in every grain of sand. To feel the silence that dwells between walls that once echoed with laughter. To discover that there are loves so deep that not even distance can completely erase them. Because this isn't just the story of a house, it's the story of all those who have had to choose between staying or leaving in search of something better. Leave us your thoughts in the comments. Tell us if you've ever had to leave your home behind, or if you know someone who built their life with their hands like Richard and Helen. Your experience enriches this community that values the stories of the countryside and the rural worker. In the lands of West Texas, where the sun punishes without mercy and rain is a blessing that comes when it pleases, lived a man named Richard Walker. He wasn't different from so many other farmers who populate these forgotten lands, but there was something in his gaze that revealed uncommon determination. Calloused hands, back bent from years of work, but a spirit that refused to surrender. Richard had met Helen at the county fair. She was different, with those eyes that seemed to understand people's souls without need for words. The courtship was simple but profound. Walks at sunset, conversations under the stars, promises whispered with the sincerity of those who know words carry weight. When they married, Richard had a dream that burned in his chest like live embers: to build his own house. He didn't have money to hire contractors or to buy expensive materials, but he had something more valuable: will and the hands of a man ready to give everything for his family. With savings from years working other people's land, he bought a small parcel of arid land on the outskirts of town. And he began to build. Stone by stone, board by board, while Helen prepared the mortar and carried materials by his side. They worked from when the sun barely peeked out until darkness defeated them. There were no complaints on their lips, only traditional songs that made the effort more bearable. Months passed and the house took shape. 2 modest bedrooms, a living room that also served as a dining room, and a kitchen with a wood-burning stove where Helen would cook for her family. The day they placed the last shingle on the roof, Richard carried Helen in his arms and crossed the threshold. "We did it, my love," he said with a voice broken by emotion. "We built our home." It wasn't long before Helen discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled that humble house with light. Richard worked with renewed vigor, knowing he was now building a future for 3. Matthew was born on a full moon night, with powerful lungs that announced his arrival to the world. He was a strong child, curious, one of those who from an early age follows his father everywhere wanting to learn. Richard carried him on his shoulders while working the land, teaching him the secrets of the earth, the language of the wind, the signs of the sky. 2 years later came Caroline, sweet and observant like her mother. She liked to help in the kitchen, learn to sew, tend the small vegetable garden Helen had planted next to the house. She had that quiet intelligence you notice in the way she looks at the world. The third was Andrew, the dreamer of the family. From early on he was different. While Matthew helped in the fields and Caroline in the house, Andrew would stand staring at the horizon, wondering what lay beyond the mesas that surrounded their land. He asked 1,000 questions of travelers who occasionally passed on the road. The house that once was just walls and roof now overflowed with life. Mornings began with the commotion of children getting ready. Meals were moments of animated conversation. Nights ended with Helen telling stories while the 3 little ones listened with wide eyes. Richard and Helen worked tirelessly to support their family. They didn't live in abundance, but they didn't lack essentials either. The children grew up healthy, surrounded by love, learning the values of honest work and dignity. Sundays, after services at the community church, they returned to share a special lunch. These simple moments were what Richard and Helen treasured more than any material possession. The years of childhood passed like wind across the plains. The children became teenagers with their own ideas and dreams beginning to take shape. Matthew had inherited his father's work ethic, but he had also heard stories from cousins who went to Dallas and now had stable jobs. Caroline read avidly any book that came into her hands, feeding her mind with knowledge beyond the basic teachings of the rural school. And Andrew, the eternal dreamer, spent more and more time looking toward the horizon. It was during dinner when Matthew gathered the courage to speak. "Father, Mother," he began with a serious voice. "I've been thinking about my future. Here in the country opportunities are limited. I want to go to the city, study, get a job that allows me to help you better." The silence that followed was heavy as the air before a storm. Richard stopped eating, his fork suspended in midair. Helen felt something in her chest tighten painfully. "Son," Richard said with a calm voice but loaded with contained emotion, "your mother and I have worked our entire lives on this land. We built this house thinking of you. What's wrong with the life we have here?" Caroline, seeing the tension in the air, added softly, "I've been thinking about leaving too, Dad. In the city there are schools where I can continue studying, where I can become a teacher. Here my future is already written." Andrew, the youngest but perhaps the most determined, added, "I also want to know other places, have different experiences. It's not that we don't love this home, it's that we want to choose our own path." Helen, with tears beginning to form in her eyes, tried to maintain composure. "My children, family is the most important thing. What will become of us when you leave? This house will be so empty." The conversation extended for hours that night. There were tears, embraces, moments of tension and moments of tenderness. Finally, Richard, with a broken voice but with the dignity that had always characterized him, gave his blessing. "If you're determined to go, I won't be the one to stop you. I only ask one thing. Don't forget where you come from and please come back to visit. This will always be your home." The day of departure came too soon. It was a cold dawn, one of those that makes your breath visible in the air. Helen had spent the night almost sleepless, checking and rechecking her children's suitcases, making sure they lacked nothing. She had prepared a special breakfast, but no one had much appetite. When the moment came to leave, everyone went out to the front yard. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon, painting the sky in pink tones. It was a beautiful dawn, but Helen couldn't appreciate it through the tears clouding her vision. Matthew hugged his mother first with strength. "Thank you for everything, Mom. I'm going to make you proud, I promise." Helen could only nod, unable to speak without her voice breaking completely. Then Matthew turned to his father. Richard opened his arms and pressed his firstborn son against his chest. "Be strong, son. Never forget who you are." Caroline was next. When she hugged her mother, both began to cry openly. "My beautiful girl," Helen said over and over. "Take care of yourself, write to us, and remember you can always come back." With her father, Caroline was briefer but equally emotional. Richard gave her a kiss on the forehead and told her, "You're stronger than you think, daughter." Andrew approached last. For Helen, seeing the youngest leave was particularly devastating. She hugged him desperately. "My boy, please be careful. Promise me you'll eat well, that you won't get into trouble." Andrew, though anxious to leave, felt a pang of guilt seeing his mother so distressed. "I promise, Mom." The three siblings took their suitcases and began walking down the path. They turned around every few steps to look back. Richard and Helen remained in the yard, he with an arm around her shoulders, both watching as the figures of their children became smaller and smaller in the distance. When the siblings were far enough away, Helen finally allowed herself to sob openly. Richard held her tightly, feeling his own tears run down his weathered cheeks. They said nothing for long minutes, simply held each other while the sun continued its ascent. When they finally returned to the house, the silence hit them like a physical wall. The children's rooms were empty, the beds made with care, waiting for a return everyone knew would take a long time. The breakfast table still had 5 chairs, but only 2 would be needed from now on. Richard tried to maintain his normal routine. He went to the fields as always, working the land with the same dedication as always. But his hands moved mechanically, his mind was elsewhere, imagining where his children might be. Helen kept busy cleaning the house over and over, as if physical activity could fill the emotional void she felt. Letters began arriving after the first month. Matthew wrote telling them he had gotten work at a factory. The hours were hard and the pay modest, but it was a start. Caroline had found employment as an assistant at a school, and was studying at night. Andrew wrote the longest letter, full of enthusiastic descriptions about the city. Helen read and reread these letters until nearly wearing out the paper. She kept them carefully in a special box. Every time the mailman came to town, her heart beat with hope. She read the letters to Richard several times, pointing out every small detail, every achievement of their children. But as months passed, the letters arrived less frequently. The children wrote about their lives, but asked less and less about their parents. They always promised to visit soon, but the visits never materialized. There was always some reason. Work didn't give them time off, tickets were expensive, there were unexpected events. The first year without the children was the hardest. Every holiday was a painful reminder of who was missing. Christmas was particularly hard. Helen had decorated the house as always, prepared an abundant dinner, set the table for 5 people with the secret hope the children would appear. But when dinner time came and there were only the 2 of them, reality fell upon her with brutal force. "Do you think they're all right?" Helen asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was small, vulnerable. "I'm sure they are," Richard responded, though he truly had no way of knowing. "They're good kids, we raised them well. I miss them so much, Richard. This house feels so big and so empty without them. Sometimes I wake up at night and go to their rooms, expecting to see them asleep in their beds. But they're always empty." Richard approached his wife and took her hands in his. "I miss them too, my love. Every day, every minute. But we must be strong. This is what we wanted for them to have opportunities." With the passing of years, Richard and Helen's routine became more fixed. Richard continued working the land, though now with more difficulty. His joints began to protest. His back bent more. Helen also felt the weight of years. Her hands trembled occasionally. Her vision wasn't as sharp as before. They developed new rituals to fill the void. Every afternoon, after Richard returned from the fields, they sat together on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset. It was their moment of peace. Sometimes they talked about old times, about when the children were small. Other times they simply remained in silence, comforted by each other's presence. The 5th year brought a crisis. Helen began with dizzy spells she attributed to fatigue, but the dizziness became more frequent, accompanied by pain and a tiredness that wouldn't disappear. Richard, increasingly worried, insisted they visit the town doctor. The diagnosis was serious. Helen had heart problems and dangerously high blood pressure. The doctor warned her she needed to rest more, reduce stress. "At your age, ma'am, the body can't handle the same load. You need to take care of yourself." Richard was terrified. The idea of losing Helen was unbearable. She was his anchor, his lifelong companion. Without her he would be truly alone. He assumed more responsibilities in the house, learning to cook, to wash clothes, tasks he had always considered Helen's domain. They decided to write to their children about Helen's condition. The responses arrived weeks later. Matthew expressed concern and offered to send money. Caroline called on the telephone, speaking at length with both parents. Andrew promised to visit soon. But no one came. Weeks turned into months, and although Helen improved somewhat with medications, the promised visit never materialized. It was another painful reminder of how low on the priority list their elderly parents were. A year later, it was Richard who had problems. A persistent chest pain he refused to admit. Until one morning, while working in the field, the pain became so intense he fell to his knees. Helen, with a neighbor's help, managed to get him to the doctor. The diagnosis was grave. Richard had suffered a minor cardiac event. No heavy work, strict medication, rest. For a man whose entire identity was tied to fieldwork, this was almost a death sentence in itself. They wrote again to their children. Andrew, surprisingly, kept his word this time. He appeared 2 months later without warning. When Helen saw him get out of the car, She could hardly believe it. She ran to the door. "Andrew, my son." The visit lasted only 3 days, but they were 3 days of joy that Richard and Helen hadn't experienced in years. The house came back to life. When the time came for Andrew to leave, he promised, "I'll come back more often, I promise. And I'm going to talk to Matthew and Caroline." After Andrew left, the house returned to its usual silence, but there was a difference. There was hope. Now, before we continue, tell us if this story has moved you. I invite you to leave your opinion by pressing the like or dislike button. If you value these stories from the countryside that remind us of the importance of family, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss more emotional tales of the rural worker. Share this video with someone who needs to remember the value of roots and family. And leave us in the comments. Have you ever had to move away from your home? Do you know someone who built their life with their hands like Richard and Helen? Your experience enriches our community. Now yes, let's continue with this story that still has much to reveal to us. The following months were different. Phone calls were more frequent, the children rotated visits, making sure at least one came each month. They weren't long visits, usually just a weekend, but they were consistent and meaningful. Richard began to write. With trembling but determined hands, he started documenting the Walker family history. He wrote about how he and Helen met, about building the house, about raising their children. He wasn't an elegant writer, but he wrote with brutal honesty and deep love. One spring afternoon, while having their coffee on the porch, Helen began to speak. "Richard, if something happened to me, if I died first, promise me you won't give up. Promise me you'll keep living." "Why are you talking like that?" Richard asked, alarmed. "Nothing's going to happen to you. We're old, my love. It's only a matter of time. And I need to know you'll be all right without me." "I won't be all right without you," Richard said with brutal honesty. "I've spent more years with you than without you. You're part of me." "Then find the other half in our children," Helen said softly. "When I'm gone, draw close to them. Promise me." Richard didn't want to make that promise, but looking into her eyes, those eyes that had loved him so completely throughout his adult life, he knew he couldn't deny her this. "I promise." Summer arrived with suffocating heat. Helen began to feel increasingly weak. There were days when she could barely get out of bed. Richard cared for her with total devotion. He read her the old letters from the children, sat by her side for hours, simply holding her hand. One late summer night, Helen was particularly lucid. Richard had lit a fire in the fireplace. They were sitting together, she resting against him, weak but at peace. "You know what I'm going to miss most?" she asked suddenly. "What, my love?" These simple moments with you. Sitting together at the end of the day, without needing to say anything important but knowing we're together. This is what we built, Richard. Not just a house, but a shared life full of these small perfect moments. "I'm going to miss this too," Richard said with tears running down his face. "Every day of my life." "Then don't forget me," she said with a small smile. "Tell the grandchildren about me. Tell them how we built this house with our own hands, how we never gave up." "I could never forget you," Richard promised. "As long as I live, you'll live too." Helen closed her eyes, smiling softly. "What a beautiful life we had, wasn't it? Despite everything, what a beautiful life we had." "The most beautiful," Richard agreed, kissing her forehead softly. They stayed like that for hours. At some point during the night, Helen stopped breathing. It wasn't dramatic or painful. She simply left, as peaceful in death as she had been in life. Richard knew exactly when it happened, but he didn't let go. He stayed there, holding her, while the fire died down to glowing embers. The days after Helen's death were the darkest of Richard's life. Neighbors came to help with funeral arrangements. The children were contacted. Matthew, Caroline, and Andrew all returned for the burial, the first time the three had been in the family home at the same time in more than a decade. The funeral was simple, as Helen would have wanted. During the ceremony, Richard was quiet and stoic, but those who knew him could see the deep pain in his eyes. His children cried, each dealing with their own guilt for not having been more present. After the funeral, the three siblings stayed a few days in the house. Walking through the home they hadn't seen in years, seeing how it had remained almost exactly as they remembered, was overwhelming. One night, the three siblings sat with their father. They talked about the future, about what Richard would do now that he was alone. Matthew suggested he come live with him. Caroline offered the same. Andrew proposed hiring someone to come daily. Richard listened to all the proposals in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm despite the pain. "I appreciate your concern, children. But this is my house. I built it with my own hands alongside your mother. Every stone has our story. I can't leave it. I'm going to die here where I belong." They reached a compromise. A young man from town would come daily to help. The siblings would take turns calling regularly and would visit more frequently. When the time came for the children to leave, the goodbyes were very different from those years ago. This time there were more hugs, more tears, more expressions of love. They promised to return soon, and this time Richard wanted to believe them. Months passed. Richard continued with his routine as best he could. The children called regularly, keeping their promise. Matthew called on Sundays, Caroline on Wednesdays, Andrew on Fridays. Richard appreciated these calls, though they also reminded him of everything he had lost. He began to speak aloud, as Helen used to do. "Look, Helen, the flowers you planted are blooming beautifully this year," he would say while working in the garden. It was his way of keeping her alive, of not feeling completely alone. More than a year passed since Helen's death. Richard had aged noticeably. His hair was completely white, his movements slower, but his eyes still maintained a glimmer of dignity. One spring day, exactly a year and a half after the funeral, something unexpected happened. Richard was on the porch when he saw not one but 3 vehicles approaching. His heart began to beat faster. When the vehicles stopped, Richard couldn't believe what he was seeing. Matthew got out of the first vehicle, followed by his wife and their 3 children. From the second came Caroline, her husband, and their 2 adopted children. From the third emerged Andrew, his wife, and a baby. "Dad!" Matthew shouted, being the first to arrive. He hugged him tightly but carefully. Caroline arrived seconds later, crying. Andrew joined the group hug. When they finally separated, Richard had tears flowing freely. "What are you all doing here?" Matthew smiled, also with tears. "Dad, we've been talking among ourselves. After Mom died, we realized how much time we'd wasted. We decided this year would be different. We're going to stay the whole week." Richard couldn't speak. The emotion was too great. Then he noticed all the children, his grandchildren whom most he barely knew. There were 6 in total. Caroline took her father's hand. "Dad, we want you to meet your family. These are your grandchildren, and they need to know their grandfather, understand their roots." During the following minutes, there was beautiful chaos of introductions. They all entered the house, and for the first time in years, the rooms resonated with life again. The children ran from room to room, exploring, asking questions. Matthew, Caroline, and Andrew toured the house with their father, pointing out things they remembered from childhood. Meanwhile, Richard simply sat, observing all the movement around him. His heart was so full he felt it might explode. This was what he and Helen had dreamed of. If only Helen could be here to see this. But in a way, he felt she was. The meal was an epic event. When they all sat around the table, they had to bring additional chairs. Before eating, Matthew asked for a moment. "Dad, could you bless us like you used to?" Richard, with a trembling but clear voice, offered a blessing. He gave thanks for the food, for the family reunited, and especially for Helen, whose spirit they felt present. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. The week was magical. The grandchildren explored the land with their grandfather. Matthew helped repair parts of the house. Caroline organized family photographs. Andrew worked in the fields. One night, Richard took his children to the small workshop. He showed them the tools he had used to build the house. "These tools built your home. Now they're yours." He also showed them the trunk where Helen had kept special things: baptismal gowns, first shoes, drawings they had made as children. The 3 siblings cried seeing these treasures. On the last day, after a special dinner, the family sat together. Richard, with Andrew's baby asleep in his lap, looked around. "I want to tell you something," he began. "This week has been the best gift. It showed me that everything your mother and I built wasn't in vain. This family is still strong." He continued, "When I'm gone, and it will be soon, I want you to remember something. This house is just things. What really matters is what we carry in our hearts. The values we taught you, the love we shared. That's the true legacy." "Dad," Matthew said, kneeling in front of his father, "we promise you something here and now. We're going to come back. Regularly. And we're going to make sure these children know their roots, understand the sacrifice and love that made their existence possible." Richard, with tears of gratitude, nodded. "Then I can rest easy." The goodbye the next day was emotional but different. There was sadness, but there was also hope. The grandchildren hugged their grandfather, promising to return soon. When the 3 vehicles pulled away, Richard remained on the porch waving goodbye. But this time, when he entered the house, it didn't feel empty. It was full of fresh memories, recent laughter, renewed promises. 2 years later, on a spring morning when the trees were in full bloom, Richard Walker died peacefully in his favorite chair on the porch. He wasn't alone. Andrew, keeping the promise, was with him. When morning came, he found his father motionless, with an expression of peace on his face, looking toward the fields he had loved so much. He was buried next to Helen. The property remained in the family, converted into a family refuge. Summers became annual reunions at the Walker house. The grandchildren brought their own partners. The house filled with life again. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows across the fields, some swear they can hear whispers. The voices of 2 souls in love who never really separated, who continue caring for the place they built with their own hands and with all their hearts. Because true love never dies. An empty house can be full of love. Physical absences don't mean emotional absences, and the most valuable legacy isn't material possessions but values, love, and memory. This story teaches us that the love of true parents means letting children fly, even though it means staying with an empty nest. It reminds us that it's never too late to reconnect, to make amends, to return to our roots. Let's value our family while we have them. Let's not wait until it's too late to say the important words, to make the pending visits, to demonstrate our love. Let's build homes, not just houses. Let's fill our spaces with love and values that endure. The Walker House teaches us that an empty house can be full of love, that the most valuable legacy is the values and love we leave in the hearts of those we love. Because in the end, when everything else fades, it's love that remains. It's love that makes us truly immortal.